And this Google Hangout on air is live. Great. Thank you for waiting, everyone. It's 5:15 in real time right now, and we were supposed to start 15 minutes ago, and that's entirely my fault. Thank you very much. This is an interview with Dr. Nyasha Junior, and it's in service of OOTLE16, the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2016, which you can find at OOTLE16.net. Hi, Nyasha. How are you?
Hello. Doing fine. Glad
Great.
to see you.
For those, for anyone who doesn't know, Dr. Junior is assistant professor of Hebrew Bible in the Department of Religion at Temple University in Philadelphia. Nyasha has written for, at last count, the Washington Post, Inside Higher Ed, and BuzzFeed. Did you also do Huffington Post stuff at some point, or am I thinking incorrectly about that?
Yes, I did for On Scripture.
Yes.
They have some sort of communication thing.
Yeah, I thought I'd seen you in HuffPo. And recently, Nyasha is the author of an introduction to Womanist biblical interpretation, which came out in 2015 from Westminster John Knox Press. Welcome, Nyasha.
Glad to be here.
You haven't been in Philadelphia for that terribly long. What's it been? Over a year now? Has it been a full year? Has it even been a year?
This is my first year in Philadelphia at Temple in their Department of Religion.
Okay, so thinking of everything I know about Philadelphia, you've been to see the Liberty Bell. Is the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia?
Yes.
Still. Yeah, you've been to see the Liberty Bell, right?
Yes, the Liberty Bell, Rocky statue.
Yeah, I was going to say. Now, how many times a week would you estimate that you wake up early, drink 5 raw eggs, and run along the pier? More than once a week? Every day?
Yes, I have not done that, but I have walked down to the art museum where the statue is.
Yeah, I actually didn't know there was a Rocky statue. Is there?
Yeah.
That's so cool. If you're of a certain age, you may be someone who saw Rocky 1 at a very impressionable age and started maybe running after dinner for 5 or 6 miles, working like 5 or 6 miles a night every night for a ridiculously long time. If you were a person of a certain age.
Many of my Temple students have not seen Rocky. I don't know how this is possible, especially when they play it nearly every weekend in Philadelphia, but they haven't seen Rocky. They also haven't seen Creed. So I don't know. Young people today, I guess.
I haven't seen Creed either. Have you seen Creed?
Of course. Yes.
Okay. Talk to me. Tell me why. Tell me about it. Tell me I want to go see Creed, and tell me why.
You do. It's next generation. So if you liked Rocky, this is the 21st century version that you need to see.
So, all right. Watchers should know that having followed Nyasha on Facebook today, Nyasha is suffering from allergies, and I happen to have a terrible cold. So, as a matter of etiquette, we're both going to agree that if either of us disappears from our screen at some point and goes off, it's not because we're doing the vile and horrible things that are associated with allergies and having a cold, but rather we've gone to let in the cat, right? So let's let that stand.
And yes, and my eyes are red because of my allergies, not because of other reasons related to today's date.
All right, wait, today's date. What don't I know about today's date?
Come on, man. Are you really that old?
Is this one of these?
Keep up.
What is it? Don't make me Google this. Tell me right now.
Come on. It's 420.
This is ringing bells. There was maybe a time in my life when this would have rung bells.
This is sad.
All right. We'll leave it as, I know, I'm almost sure I know what you mean in it. We'll leave it as an exercise.
You're becoming like the dad.
I've been working on my dad joke game. Yeah, I feel like it's really coming along. My son is 15 now, and I feel like I'm right. I am right perfectly in that groove. Yes, I am. Yeah. So basically, whenever I'm around him and his friends, I just like say something about something that I do, and I refer to it as my game, and I declare that it's on point.
Okay. Yes, you are turning into a dad.
Yeah, I pretty much have him right where I want him. Nyasha, something I was thinking about when we were talking about talking today, and maybe it's come up with us before, but I remembered from looking through some of your stuff that you self-identify as a bookworm, and that you were a bookworm even as a child.
This is true.
I reflect from time to time. I mean, as any educator, like a lot of us become educators and in the humanities in the ways that we do, in part because we're bookworms as children. And one of the things that flummoxes us is people who aren't bookworms and who aren't bookworms from children.
I am flummoxed by this.
Yeah, so tell me now, I'd actually like to hear a little bit about this. Some of the things I hope to talk about today with you is, of course, teaching, because we always talk about teaching. We ought to talk about the Pentateuch because you really care about the Pentateuch, and it's your show, it's your interview. And I also want to talk about Womanist, an introduction to Womanist biblical interpretation. So whatever else we talk about it when I talk about those things. But I'm trying to be, so I try to be fair in my mind, right? People come from a lot of different backgrounds, and it's not somebody's fault if they weren't raised to love reading, especially fiction and poetry from a young age, any more than anything else that might just not be a part of what you grow up with, either for just it's not what your family's into, because of whether you have access and so on. So that said, I kind of sometimes a little bit don't know what to say to learners who are trying to learn to read the Hebrew Bible in the ways that I mean when I say read the Hebrew Bible, because they can read the Hebrew Bible but not do what I mean when I say read the Hebrew Bible. And in an important sense, sometimes what I'm doing is I'm trying to teach someone to read, or even just to start out, teach them what I mean when I say read, which might not be the same thing they mean when they say read. What's your walking around on that, Nyasha? That is, I mean, my uncharitable reflex is, if I could imagine,
You
if I had a
mean
magic wand,
uncharitable?
well, okay, so if I could do anything I wanted without caring about the feelings of others, as some of the better people in my life have taught me to do, I would just say to students, go away, go read everything you can get your hands on for 10 years, and then come back, and then we can do a course on an introduction to the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Go read, Harry Potter, read Danielle Steele, read Marvel Comics, read Shakespeare if you want to, read good stuff or whatever, but read like crazy. And then when and only when you have found that you have had your perceptions of yourself and of the world and perhaps of God changed by a work of literary fiction or of poetry, then come back and we will do this thing. But until then, and this is completely idiosyncratic, right? This is really about my limitations. This is really about my trying to get outside of my own parochial sort of preparation for Hebrew Bible. But to say, until then, I don't really know in some ways what to do with you. Do I put it too extremely for you, or what do you think about that?
Well, I would separate the bookworm stuff from the let's read stuff. So I feel like if you're not already a bookworm and you're an adult, that's going to be pretty tough to convince you to become one. Because I mean, being a bookworm for me is part of my identity. It's not just that I like books or I like reading. It's fundamental to who I am. So I always have a book with me no matter what. And I have since I was able to read, according to my mother. So with students, what I try to do is to help them to see that they already have some of the interpretive skills that I'm looking for, but we just need to polish those up. So for example, I say, well, I used to say this about letters, but no one has letters anymore. So emails or even text messages. So I say, if there's a particular person that you, let's say, have a romantic interest in, and there's a long text thread about this, you and your friends get together and you try to interpret this thread. What did the person mean by this? how do I understand this emoji in this context? Does this LOL mean the same as the other LOL? Like, so you do have skills and you are aware of the importance of interpretation because you need to know how to respond to this thread. I also mentioned the syllabus. So I say, you know, it has come to my attention that many of my students, although they claim they are not terribly great interpreters, are masters of understanding the syllabus and its nuances and looking for loopholes. Well, if I can be absent this number of times, but I'm late this many times, how does that work? Or if this book is recommended but not required, then I don't have to buy that, right? So I try to explain how they do have skills in reading and in interpreting, and I just want them to try to apply those to the biblical text that we're reading with the same kind of urgency and looking in all the nooks and crannies and asking questions instead of just accepting the information at face value.
I like the syllabus example in part because I want to talk about womanist biblical interpretation, and it occurs to me that the way you talk about the syllabus thing, it's like, okay, I was thinking, oh yeah, okay, so these are folks like with text messages, for example, and emojis or emails, who already, as you say, have learned intuitively at least, and then they just need to learn to reflect on it, maybe about trying to find out what someone means. What do they mean when they say thus and so? People, you know, like old people like me who say, why does it say LOL if they didn't laugh out loud, you know? And it turns out LOL has a variety of meanings depending on user and context that are no longer tied to the etymological meaning of LOL and so on. And that's something I can
that's
learn,
the
right?
dad explanation.
Yeah, right. Like I like the conciliatory LOL, right? When someone kind of puts in an LOL as a way of saying, as a way of nodding, right? As a way of saying something and then adding LOL in the way that in person you might nod or say right, or what do you think, or do you agree? But so that's all about like trying to find out what the person meant, which in biblical studies would correspond to trying to find the original meaning of the text, right? If we're reading something from Isaiah of Jerusalem and we're trying to figure out what it meant in Isaiah of Jerusalem's time, or if we're reading a part of the Pentateuch that we have reason to believe is from the priestly source and we're trying to find out what it would have meant for the priestly writer and his agendas. But then you say the syllabus, and part of what I like about that is, you know, when you're exegeting a syllabus, as you suggested, Nyasha, it's not even just all about what does the professor mean, but what is the range of possible meanings that this part of this paragraph in the syllabus can support, and importantly, can I find a reading that is liberating for me in terms of my desire to not spend 3 hours doing this recommended reading, but rather spending that 3 hours watching Captain America with my 15-year-old, right? So this is my way of saying, is that a sensible transition to talking about womanist biblical interpretation in the way that I seem to think it is? In terms of interpretation not being in some cases, or I shouldn't say in some cases, in some aspects, interpretation is about trying to understand the meaning of the text as it may have been understood by its author and in its original context. But also interpretation, we find, is about contending with the range of possible readings, advocating for some readings for reasons, and searching for readings that maybe don't exist yet but should.
Yes, I think you can get from A to B that way.
Okay, that's my way. So you, what is womanist biblical interpretation, and why did you decide to write about it? It's your first book-length book. It's your first really long-form work, I think, after your dissertation. Am I right about that? So that's a big choice. So what some of the things I want to hear about is, what is it for people who never heard of it, who don't know about it, right? And why did you decide to go at that rather than other things?
Sure, I'll take the second one first. So why? So I finished my dissertation at Princeton Theological Seminary, which is where I met the good Dr. Lester. And after you finish your dissertation and hopefully get a job, which I had, you have to figure out now what. So for some people in academia, that means publishing your dissertation. So you edit it, clean it up, fix all the things that your committee noticed at the last minute, and then submit that to a publisher. One thing about that is sometimes in certain institutions, that's double dipping. So what I mean by that is that for some institutions, you got quote unquote credit for your dissertation when you got your PhD. So if you publish something that's not a thorough revision of it, then you don't really get credit for it the same way. So that's always something you have to think about, depending on your institution. For me, it wasn't an institutional issue as much as just, I need to move on with my life. So I had lived for years with the topic. So my dissertation topic was Genesis 39, which is the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife. And I was just sick of it and needed to do something else. And in conversation with people I trusted, some of it was about, what do you actually want to write? What do you want to say? What are you interested in? And I kept coming back to, I wish people would stop assuming that I'm a womanist, and I wish that I could explain what womanist biblical interpretation is. So really, I took a risk in saying that I want my first monograph length book to be something that's more accessible, something that's an introduction, something that does not involve a lot of technical language, jargon, and the like. But it's something I wanted to do, and the institutions I was affiliated with were okay with that. So that's how I ended up writing that project.
When you say that people, you say people assumed you were a womanist biblical scholar, in the same way that, you hear stories from women on Bible faculty where there's an assumption that they really are all about feminist readings of the text, and that's what they want to write about and talk about all the time.
Yes. So it wasn't even within biblical studies, but just assuming that I must identify as a womanist, and then therefore was doing something called womanist biblical interpretation. But just making lots of assumptions about me and about the type of work that I was doing.
Yeah. I recently saw, not very long ago, in the unofficial SBL Facebook group, and SBL is the Society of Biblical Literature, right? And it doesn't have an official Facebook group, at least I don't think it does yet, but it suffers the existence of an unofficial Facebook group. And there was some that not very long ago, it's probably been a few months, but somebody misused the word womanist, and it was clear that to this person, womanist was more or less a synonym for feminist, and hilarity ensued in that thread. So for that person and for others, what is womanism? What is womanist theology? What is womanist biblical scholarship? What is all this?
Okay, so first, buy the book.
Yeah, and
all
also
of the answers are in the book.
Be aware that this is an interview, and there's a whole book there's a reason you wrote a book about it, and if you could say it in a few minutes in an interview, you wouldn't have had to write the book. But give us the taste, yeah.
Okay, so African-American writer Alice Walker defines womanist in a lengthy 4-part definition in her book, In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. As part of the definition, she includes womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. Okay, She also mentions that Womanist is a feminist of color. So for some people, they understand a womanist to be a Black woman who's interested in feminism, who may choose not to identify herself as a Black feminist, but may prefer to use the term womanist for a variety of reasons. That does not do justice to the issue, but that's a brief snippet.
No, and so, I mean, you're right. And someone might ask, I'm not saying that like, someone might ask because they want to know, not because this would be like a good dismissal of womanist biblical theology, but womanist theology and womanist biblical scholarship. Like, okay, so there's this thing called feminism and feminist biblical scholarship, and you're saying that there's some ways that like you're not covered, you know, that your interests and your concerns and your history and your voice are not covered by womanist, say, biblical scholarship. And there's African-American biblical scholarship, right? And you might feel that as a woman, if that's a male-dominated enterprise, that as a woman you're not covered. But then aren't you covered by the combination, right? As long as there's African-American biblical scholarship and as long as there's feminist biblical scholarship, like where's the lack of coverage? I don't offer that as an actual, you know what I mean? Like,
yes.
How should that person put that together, right?
It's not so much a matter of coverage as it is how you approach it. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that feminism itself, without the biblical studies, has a history of excluding women who were not white women, who were not affluent, educated women. So the term itself is already problematic for a number of people. When you add feminist approaches to biblical studies, often feminist approaches within biblical studies focus on issues of gender. Not entirely, but that's generally part of the focus of a feminist approach. So there are biblical scholars who are also African-American women who have identified some of their work as womanist biblical interpretation, taking not just a feminist approach, but what they're considering to be a womanist approach. Part of the issue that I talk about in the book, though, is that you can't simply have feminist / womanist, which I see a lot, I think, as a way to be more inclusive, because it suggests that the two are equivalent. And one of the things that I discuss in my book is that at this point, we haven't had the same kind of scholarly output from scholars who are identifying themselves and their work as womanists within biblical studies. So at this point, we don't have a clear consensus about what a womanist approach might look like. Within feminist approaches in biblical studies, there's still a lot of wiggle room, but people pretty much know it when they see it. And we also have, 40 years worth of that work, so that even if someone, say, for example, Beverly Gaventa doesn't identify her work as feminist, although she does a lot of work on women in biblical texts. Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Gaventa. Her book is still going to be covered in a class on feminist biblical interpretation. So we use different terms in different ways and put people in different categories. And what I wanted to do was to problematize this idea that all African-American women identify as womanists and all the African-American women in SBL, which is not a very large number, but all of them do something called womanist biblical interpretation.
Yeah, for those who are not part of the Society of Biblical Literature or even the American Academy of Religion, those who aren't professionals, lay people, the last time I looked at published statistics, and you may know statistics on Black women in SBL, but last I checked, women made up considerably less than 30% of the Society of Biblical Literature. I want to say 26% was the percentage I saw a couple of years back anyway.
Yes, I don't remember the stats because they were so terrible. And it was also, they were trying to count in weird ways. So how do you use US racial categories if you're talking about a global membership? So how do you count someone who's perhaps from South Africa? Unless we're going to start asking, well, are you white South African? Are you black South African? Are you Asian? Like, are you colored? Are you what? Like, so our US racial categories don't fit everywhere in the world. But suffice it to say, of the very few SBL members who are African American women, they're not a whole bunch of them.
So one of the things when we write about stuff, right? We, I just as a parenthetical, of course, when I was getting ready to talk to you, I went and looked at the reviews that really matter. And by the reviews that really matter, obviously, I mean Amazon reviews and Goodreads reviews. And folks had a lot to say.
Rate my professor.
Yeah. Well, but what I saw is that folks have a lot to say. And I thought this was interesting. I just wanted to follow up with you on this, is about how well written, for one thing, right? Very concise, and how helpful folks found it as an introduction. So maybe we'll have a few words to say about writing down the line here. I'm not sure, but I did want to ask you, clearly your introduction serves as an introduction, right? It's an introduction for people who don't already know things about womanist biblical scholarship and womanist biblical interpretation and who want to find out. But as you suggest, right, especially when a field is kind of early or at some crisis point, there's an opportunity there to sort of chart out what we think ought to happen and where we think things ought to go. So I'd be interested in hearing anything that you have to say, without giving away everything in your book, but maybe as a teaser. Do you have ideas about what you call womanist biblical interpretation, what it could be doing that it's not, what it could be doing more of that it's already doing, or what it should do less of, or any of that kind of thing? Like, where should it be going, do you think, for you?
I cover this in the last chapter of the book, which some of my readers have told me was kind of a surprise ending. In writing it, I didn't intend it to be a surprise, but I guess some people were surprised by where I ended up. So one of the things that I say is that the term womanist has become the territory of African American women. And I don't see women who are not Black women using that term. I don't see that happening. What I imagine may happen is that people may use the work of Black feminist and womanist writers and call what they're doing something else. So they may call it, for example, intersectional feminist work. They may call it some newfangled term that the kids dream up. But I don't see it developing, because I think that term, for very good reasons, has been staked out by Black women. So that may be a way in which it's difficult for there to be a lot of development, because, as we've discussed, there aren't so many African American women in biblical studies. Not all of them use womanist. And so of the few who remain, if they're the only ones who can do it, then we're not looking at a lot of potential for growth and development. Okay,
so you, as you said, you wrote on Genesis 39 when you were doing your dissertation. And there's a reason that you and I are interviewing this week. That is, my students happen to be picking up the Pentateuch for the first time this week. Yay for them! They must be so excited. I wrote them and asked them when I gave them the marching orders for the week, whether they ever thought I was going to finally have them read biblical texts that they'd ever heard of before. Because I started them on the writings, and then we did the latter prophets, and then we did the former prophets, and now we're doing this for reasons. And but I know from history that you love the Pentateuch, and you especially love Genesis, and you're very excited about students. So is that for you, is your love of the Pentateuch and of Genesis in particular, does that have a lot to do with just how much narrative there is there?
Yes.
Okay.
All the good, juicy stories are in there. Were you talking to my friend Dr. Erickson last week?
I was.
Was she talking about wisdom lit or some such?
She was talking about poetry, and I should be honest and say that we had, we had technological problems for that one as well, that I don't think were my fault, but nonetheless, we only got about a good half an hour in, and I want to pick up with a part 2 with Dr. Erickson, Amy Erickson. But we had gotten going on poetry, and she's teaching a course on poetry in the Hebrew Bible, and we found ourselves getting carried away talking about poetry. And so now I want to talk with you a little bit about narrative. And
narrative is the good stuff.
What makes it the good stuff?
Because it's fun, it's exciting, it's like, it's reality TV from biblical texts. It's family drama, baby mama drama, who doesn't like whom, who got kicked out, who slept with whose husband. Like, it's all juicy stuff. So that's how I try to get my students into it. So before they have to read something, I'll say, so this week you're reading about the other woman and what happens when the other woman has a baby. And they're like, oh, really? Is that what kind of class is this? So it really is just Genesis 16 and 21, but you make it sound interesting. You make it sound like a soap opera, like something that they can relate to. So even if it doesn't match up with our contemporary notions of relationships and relationship categories, it's still about human feelings. It's still about families and messed up things. So it's all fun. I mean, poetry, I guess, can be interesting, but the narratives, that's where the action is.
I'm also someone who came to poetry only as an adult, and what I was formed by and shaped by in my youth was absolutely narrative fiction. So I'm with you there, and I get that. Do you find, and it's true, and especially I agree, the Genesis stories, that is maybe more than, I don't know if it's more than other parts of the Bible, but certainly in a different way from other parts of the Hebrew Bible. I do find that, yeah, once you start introducing people, once you just get people reading the actual stories, people are always shocked and appalled at what's actually in the Hebrew Bible. Getting past that expectation that what they're going to see is sort of an unending parade of fine moral examples marching by, carved out of white marble or something like that.
Yes, and my students are always shocked by this. So whether they grew up in communities that use these texts or not, they still have ideas that the Bible is supposed to be like puppy dog tails and rainbows and sunshine and how we should be good, upright, moral people. And so when we talk about Abraham kicking out Hagar and Ishmael, they're like confused. Like, is this in the Bible, really? He kicked her out? And even when they want to continue to celebrate Abraham, the patriarch, well, you know, God told him it would be okay. Well, you know, you have to understand it was a different time or whatever. Then we just go back to other things that we've discussed. So Abraham's rich by now, right? And he sends her off with bread and water.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not an entourage, not a bodyguard, not a caravan. Just get out, really?
Well, this is me making my case for why I have my students slog through the Hebrew Bible backwards. It is a part of my hope that after they've sort of seen in the writings competing visions of what God is and what God wants from people, and whether the righteous are rewarded and whether or not the wicked are punished, or whether that's not reliably the case, and all that kind of stuff. And once they've learned that the prophets aren't all saying the same thing as one another, but are, you know, have different ideas about the temple and whether God will preserve the temple and why and when, my hope is that by that time they're in a better position to read an Abraham and Hagar story and say, I don't know what the heck this story is going to be trying to push in terms of what I should think of Abraham's activity or Hagar's activity or God's activity in the text. That like that's my hope is that by this time learners are in the best possible situation to approach such a text and be like, I can't even guess what this text is going to be pushing at me. Does that make sense?
I get it. It's a lot to slog through before you have the reward of the Pentateuch.
You chose that word on purpose because I once said that I said something about slogging through the Pentateuch once, and you reprimanded me that we don't slog through the Pentateuch.
We do not.
Sometimes we slog through the writings a little bit, I'll confess. So yes. When we come back to so when we're reading Genesis, now that you've been doing womanist biblical interpretation, now that you've been doing your book, Womanist Biblical Introduction to Womanist Biblical Interpretation, is there anything, I don't know, not new, well, maybe new, is there, are there things that you're seeing in the tales of Genesis as you teach them that have your attention that didn't have your attention before? Is there anything, is there any way in which you're walking around with maybe one or two or three adjusted lenses from what you had before? Or conversely, I know you've loved Genesis forever. Are there things that you just already loved about the stories of Genesis that you really were excited to bring to womanist biblical, to an introduction to womanist biblical interpretation, and you're sort of thinking about that? I guess I'm asking on behalf of students who are maybe my students who are just getting ready to get into Genesis. And who are sort of like, wow, I'm interested in this womanist biblical interpretation business. What good is it going to do me? Is it going to make me see Genesis differently? What would I be getting in for if I did?
Oh, I don't know.
Or am I asking it wrong?
Too close.
What do you think?
Well, I think I'm too close to it. And so I will say, I mean, my book is not a how-to. So my book is not how to do womanist biblical interpretation, which I found some of my readers thought the answers would be found in the book. But also people thought it was going to be a commentary.
Why would we be peddling answers in any form?
I don't do answers. Other people thought it was going to be a commentary. So I was going to like march through the Hebrew Bible, pointing out all of the things a womanist biblical interpreter would notice or something. That doesn't happen either. So what I will say is after writing the first book, An Introduction to Womanist Biblical Interpretation, my second book is in fact a reception history of Hagar. So at this point, I think I'm probably too close to it to figure out quite how I got from one to the other. For me, it just kind of bubbled up. But I think it's more just, I love Genesis, so I'm happy to stick with that.
A reception history, you said the reception history of Hagar, and my coffee went down the wrong pipe. Really?
Yes, so I have a contract with Oxford University Press, and I'm working on the second book now. And what I'm interested in looking at is how different communities look at this particular biblical character as either an insider or an outsider, depending on how they're trying to use her. So is she someone who is part of the family and lineage of Abraham, and she and her son are rightly part of that? Or is she the outside woman who should be kicked out and who has no place within this community? So I'm interested in looking at how different interpretive communities use her to make their arguments about inclusion and exclusion.
So what some hearers might not know is when we talk about reception history in this way, most of us weren't raised to care about what anybody made of the biblical text in that window of time between Mr. I wrote Isaiah, or Mr. I wrote Nahum, or Mr. I wrote Genesis 20, between the time they put it down and right now. We don't care about anything that happens in between then. What biblical criticism has largely been about is better understanding the original meaning, the likely original meaning of the text for its author and their probable communities, and then maybe like what it can mean to us. What shall it mean to us? And us is us in some church community, in some current circumstance. Now, this is the how does it preach, piece of things. And this idea, and everything in between was history of interpretation, which a few weirdos cared about. But for, especially as educators, certainly I have often felt that the history of interpretation is what learners are walking in with that they have to unlearn, right? The whatever ideas they've picked up along the way about Esther or Abraham or Hagar or whoever is probably just a bunch of misinformation that needs to be put aside so they can sort of start as a tabula rasa, as a blank slate, and far from that. And whereas now, not only are we encouraged, really, right, to have much better appreciation that folks are coming in, that these interpretations and these receptions, these ways of receiving the text in culture that learners are influenced by and carrying with them have value, right? As a pedagogue, there's always the course of thing where it's like all new learning can only be attached to existing learning, right? You can't. The only way they're going to, as a pedagogy person, I would want to say, yeah, well, let's, we're learning now, or some of us are only learning recently, now, that if they're going to learn what I have to teach them about Esther, it's only going to be by integrating it with what they're walking in on Esther. So that stuff has to be appreciated and valued.
And that's one of the things that I try to do with students, is to tell them they already have some notions, some ideas that they got from somewhere, even if they're not really sure where those ideas came from. Because when we finally sit down to read the text, they say, but this isn't what I thought, or this isn't what I had in mind. So we talk about where did they get some of those ideas from. Sometimes it's just family, church, VeggieTales, pop culture, those kinds of things. So for example, before we read Samson, we talk about, so what do you know about Samson? Just if I say Samson from the Bible, what do you know? He was big, he was strong. There was something about this woman. There was some woman and hair, something like that. So when we finally sit down and read Samson, they say, oh my stars, this dude he has anger management issues. He's a criminal. He's killing people. He's a terrorist. But I try to incorporate what they already have. And then we talk about the biblical text. But then we also talk about some of the things that they're getting from pop culture that weren't in the text. So the notion of this is a big love story. So we watch clips from Samson and Delilah, the Cecil B. Mill version, which they think is hilarious because they keep saying, but that's not in there. That's not in there. There's nothing like that. A sister? Where'd she get a sister from?
I'm so glad Cecil B. DeMille never touched Ruth.
That would have been scandalous. But yes, so we talk about where they already are, and then we integrate that with what we're learning in the text, and then also from other elements. So some sort of way in my mind, moving from the Womanist book to Hagar made sense. But the direct connection or how it happened, it was just, okay, what's my next project?
Yeah. Okay. Oh, I'm looking forward to that. Everybody is into reception history now. I have so much to learn. I've been trying to read. I've read Brennan Breed's Nomadic Text, which I think is a really Brennan Breed's Nomadic Text. There's his name. Let's get it right in there. But I'm going to have to read it again. I'm at that point in the reading, and this happens when I read things that are going to make a pretty big difference to me, is I read it once and I have that experience of every paragraph or so, I just keep saying, wow, that makes total sense. Wow, I'm really excited about that. Wow, that makes total sense. Wow, and then I finish the book and I'm like, what did I just read? like, I don't know what just happened. It was really exhilarating. I felt like I was on like a roller coaster at Six Flags Great America, and I'm not really sure what happened or what I think about it. And so then I got to go back and I got to read it again. So that's where I'm at with Breed's Nomadic Text right now.
I have a short response, not to the full book, so it's not a book review, but Dr. Breed did a brief review of, not review, a sort of excerpt of his book for Columbia Theological Seminary. And I and a couple of other scholars wrote responses to that. So that might also be something you want to check out.
You did, and I think, was Jeremy Skipper one of those?
Yes.
Who wrote, and who else? Do you remember offhand?
I want to say Bill Brown, but maybe that's just because I'm thinking of Columbia. If
somebody wanted to find that, I've got it bookmarked somewhere, but if a viewer wanted to find that, what are they going to Google, do you think, to find that piece? Because I remember it very well.
I think it's called On Points, Columbia Theological Seminary, On Points,
So,
Brennan Breed.
On Points, Columbia Theological Seminary, Brennan Breed, probably Nomadic Text, and
I think something like
and
that.
that stuff will come up. Yeah, I remember reading that. It was very valuable. Well, I won't get into why it was valuable. It was for lots of things. So I encourage folks to take a look at that. Nyasha, I know we started late because of me, and we're past 6. Do you have like 5 minutes to go on and before we wrap it up, or are you time constrained?
Of course, for you, I will stay.
Okay, so I have one more. There's one more thing I wanted to talk with you about because I was interested. I can remember there was a time, although it would be hard to believe now, when you were asking around with questions about social media and Twitter and so on. And obviously along the way, you decided that social media, that engaging social media has value because you've gone on to do that. What do you have to say about that? What do you have to say for yourself? No, obviously, I don't need to be persuaded. But it's a question in the field, isn't it, right? That is traditionally, if you go back to when blogging was still really a thing before Twitter, Facebook, and other kinds of micro blogging platforms sort of took over. But back in the heyday of the blog, it was a very common topic, right? Should you blog? Does it just take away from the time that you should be writing? Even if you find blogging valuable, will those who assess you at your institution believe that you are just wasting your time when you should be writing publishable works? What is the value of doing this, if any? And of course, bloggers didn't need to be persuaded, but different bloggers had different things to say about why they found it valuable. Fast forward to now, when it's not just blogging and the communities of commenters and people following each other there, but Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and I don't know, fill in Pinterest, right? So it's kind of all happening. What's the and things like this, right? What's the value? Why is it okay to do that kind of thing when you could be hunkered down, you know, finishing your Hagar and reception history?
Good question. So we were just discussing this. I was at Wabash Center for a conversation with their publications board. I'm on their digital media something group. So first, let me say, as an academic, the first thing I counsel people is to consider, what are people at your institution going to say? This is a real issue that you do need to keep in mind. So I don't tell people you should or you shouldn't, but I say be aware of your institutional context. So there are some institutions that, whatever, don't care, don't know, whatever. And there are others that really will see it as a waste of time and you should be doing other things. So they don't view it neutrally, but in fact as negative. So you need to keep that in mind. And certainly if you're a student, understand that faculty, potential employers, if you're planning on going to grad school, they will Google you and they will find you. And I know of at least one student for sure I know who was not admitted into a doctoral program because of things that were found online. And there are probably others as well. So I say just be careful, be think through what your particular issues might be. That being said, for me, at Temple, the marketing department loves me. My own religion department is not really on social media, so they don't know much. And it's okay. Occasionally someone will say, can you put something out there on the thing that, you know, tell people about it on the internet? So they don't really have a clear idea of what social media is. I have been getting a bit more attention. My Twitter account, which is Nyasha Junior, NYASHA JUNIOR, was named one of the 15 academic Twitter accounts you should be following.
I remember seeing that. I should have brought that up at the beginning. That was exciting.
Yes. So for me, social media is like a faculty lounge. So it's a way for me to connect with lots of other scholars in other places, people I would never see except maybe at AAR SBL. So there are people I have formed. It may sound weird if you're not on social media, but people I formed relationships with, people I quote unquote talk to every day. I hear about scholarship. I hear about books that are out, conferences, call for papers, those sorts of things way before I get them on email, if ever. I've received invitations for speaking engagements. It allows me to connect with readers. I've even Skyped with classes that are reading my book. So for me, it's a way to connect with people, people I might never see in my own classroom or people I might never see at a professional meeting. So for me, it's been worth it. Again, I don't recommend it for other people. I say, think it through and decide how you want to engage and on which platforms.
It's a really good, it's really well put. I mean, you talk about it being a faculty lounge. I mean, that's been my experience for a very long time, is that social media, whether blogging or anything else, has always been not the equivalent of writing, not the equivalent of publication. It's not an analog of publication, and it's not even an analog of conference papers, but it's the analog of leaving my office door open and raising my voice really loud so the person across the hall can hear me, and just bouncing ideas or exclamations or what have you. And also, and I don't think I've talked about this yet with anyone, so I don't know how well this is going to come out or how much it makes sense, but like, I can certainly say that if it weren't for sort of being on Twitter and sort of dipping my ear and my eye into those conversations every day, day after day, less so Facebook, but some groups on Facebook, some specific groups and communities on Facebook, certainly. There are so many, and I'll just name for starters, the Black Lives Matters movement, going back, I guess, where I would put a pin in the timeline would be the Ferguson protests, and that whole academic year that led up to the Baltimore protests, and sort of what, at least whatever the reality is in the world, the way that my awareness of that morphed into awareness of Black Lives Matters. If I did not have social media, my perception of not only Black Lives Matters, but like 20 other things that actually matter in my institution, my only awareness of those things would be filtered through my institution. Does that make sense? That is, my awareness of those things would really be almost entirely what I hear about them from the 20 other faculty that we have here at Garrett Evangelical.
Right.
And then what would I have to contribute?
It makes my world wider.
Yeah.
So as you were saying, it's like leaving your door open. For me, it's at Princeton Theological Seminary, the biblical studies students had a suite. It is not as lush as you might be thinking when you think suite. It was a room with a big table and chairs. So please don't think it was that fancy. But Dr. Lester before he was the good doctor, would be camped out in the suite. And when I was just a youngster coming up in the game, I would pop into the suite and we'd all be doing work, but someone would look up and say, hey, how would you translate this? Or what do you think about this issue? Or has anybody seen...
what's interesting?
Right. So for me, it's sort of like that. I'm doing my work, but along the way, I'm listening to people say, hey, isn't this interesting? Or did you see this? Or what do you think about that? And it gives me a much wider range of perspectives than I would get from my in real life perspectives. So for example, one of the things that I mentioned I wrote a piece in Inside Higher Ed about, for the first time, asking students for their pronouns in class. Well, trust and believe at Princeton Theological Seminary, at no point in time was that ever discussed in a teaching workshop. So these were things that I learned from interacting with people on Twitter, from interacting with people who are trans or who are trans allies or people who are simply LGBT allies or activists. And so thinking about that and being influenced by that, I said, well, how can I be more inclusive in my classroom, even though I'm not teaching a gender and sexuality class or something like that? How can I be more inclusive? So asking students for their pronouns and also explaining why I'm doing that and why it's important. And just as I ask them their name, I don't walk up to someone and say, you look like a Bruce. I think you must be Bruce because you remind me of a Bruce. You have Bruce-like characteristics. I think that must be your name. I don't do that. I ask you your name. I tell students how I like to be addressed. So I explain, I'm Dr. Junior. You can call me Dr. Junior or Professor Junior. So we establish that. And in the same way that we do that with names, we can also do that with pronouns. So whether you're trans or not, it's a way to be inclusive and to bring up those issues in the classroom. But I never would have learned anything about that except for social media, because it just wouldn't have come across my daily life or the newspapers I read. It just wouldn't have happened.
I mean, how can you not be a better scholar for living in a larger world, exactly as you said? Yeah. Well, I want to thank Nyasha. We'll sign off here, and then I'll ask you to stay on so I can say a proper goodbye to you in the green room. But in front of everyone, I'll say thank you so much for coming and taking some time in the evening on a weekday out of your personal time, your uncompensated time, to have a conversation with me and for others. Folks who want to learn, who want to see more of Nyasha online, probably the most direct route to that is to go to Nyasha's website, which is nyashajunior.com, NYASHA junior.com. Anywhere else people should go to look for you there, Nyasha, besides your Twitter account, which is also Nyasha Junior?
No, the website has all my contact info, so that's the easiest place to go.
Fantastic. Good. Congratulations again on an introduction to Womanist Biblical Interpretation, published in 2015 with Westminster John Knox Press. And thanks to everyone for watching. And Nyasha, thanks again for joining me.
Thank you.